I would like to welcome you all as people are signing in, both to the webinar and also following us live on Facebook, to this webinar, which is, let me explain a little thing, a couple of things about the webinar. It's part of a project run by the Center for International European Studies at Kadir Has University, the International Relations Council of Turkey, and the Institute of International Relations at Pantheon University of Athens. And it's a project exploring the role of Turkey both as a partner and a challenge for European security. And it's a project funded by the CATS network, the Center for Applied Turkey Studies, which is based at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. And this network, and it's funded, the network and the project is funded both by the federal German Federal Office, Foreign Office, and the Mercator Stiftung. And the novelty of our project is that it's a project exploring Turkey and European security and the relationship made up entirely of only Greek and Turkish researchers. We are, within the next 10 or 15 days, we will be publishing 4 of the first papers that are products of joint research work between Greek and Turkish researchers, and a few more will be coming out in the next couple of months, as well as a policy report. So given also the context of the COVID era, pandemic, a lot of the work we wanted to do and events we wanted to do in person, we have to do them online. And so this is part of the first event. And we thought we'd start off this series with a topic that is of great concern and interest to all of us, which is given the recent last week's European Council meeting on the 25th of March, and its statement, not conclusions, because it was online, regarding the future of Turkey-EU relations. We wanted to have a first assessment, and I'm very glad that with us in this panel are 4 experts, veritable experts, on the issue of EU-Turkey relations. And it'd be interesting to have a debate, hear their views and have a debate, and then we'll take on your questions as well. So the 4 experts with us are Professor Çiğdem Nas, who is the Secretary General of Economic, IKV, which is the Economic Development. I'm blanking Foundation, exactly. Based in Istanbul, and she's also a professor of international relations at Yildiz Technical University. We have Professor Kostas Ifantis, who is a professor of international relations at the Pantheon University of Social Sciences in Athens, who until very recently, last year, was also a colleague of mine at Kadir Has University. Dorothee Schmid, who is the head of the Turkey and Middle East program at IFRI, the French Institute of International Relations in Paris, where she has been in charge of Turkey, IFRI's contemporary Turkey program since 2008, and Günter Seufert, who is actually the head of the Center for Applied Turkey Studies, CATS, at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. And as I said, all 4 of them know the issues very well, follow up the issues, write often policy papers. I know, Çiğdem, you recently co-authored one, right, with the IPC and other colleagues, and Günter, Dorothee, and Kostas are present everywhere trying to deal with this issue. So I will give them the floor. I've asked them each to talk about 10 minutes to sort of explain the context, Çiğdem Nas from a Turkish perspective, Kostas Ifantis from a Greek perspective and an EU perspective. Same thing, Günter and Dorothee from the national perspective and EU perspective. And basically the issue is, what does this statement mean? Where do relations stand and where do they go? And there's a wider context there as well. I mean, what does actually Turkey want in terms of EU-Turkey relations beyond the positive agenda? Because with the statement, almost immediately the Turkish Foreign Ministry came out with a statement of its own addressing the statement. And also the wider context is, given the fact that we are living in a changing world, systemic change and so on, is the EU up to the task of dealing it's particular with its relations with Turkey? Because one of the first things you see in the statement and previous conclusions Here's Turkey, a candidate state, negotiating its accession. There's no mention of that. It's basically a totally different sort of nature of a relationship, transactional relationship. So Çiğdem, we'll start off with you, and we'll move on to the others.
Okay, thank you very much for also inviting me. So I will try to talk briefly about the Council and what it means for the Turkey-EU relations. Of course, I mean, what we are witnessing is, I think, a transformation in the nature of the relationship between Turkey and the European Union. Of course, there is a discrepancy in the fact that Turkey is a candidate country officially. However, the accession process is not continuing since 2018. I mean, it was officially announced that no new chapters could be opened. There have been some maybe complementary or maybe alternative also avenues which were opened, like the modernization process of the customs union, visa liberalization, and refugee cooperation issues. However, again, except for maybe refugee cooperation, we couldn't have also much improvement in these other areas. So I think what we are witnessing is maybe the difficulties and the paradoxes of this relationship, especially the ongoing transformation in the relationship. Of course, I mean, on the part of Turkey, of course, I mean, I think there's also a sort of lack of understanding on the part of Turkey. The Turkish government is also still expressing that the strategic goal of EU membership is still valid for Turkey. However, as you have already mentioned, when we look at EU reports or EU conclusions, they prefer not to talk anymore about candidacy or membership perspective. So they mostly refer to Turkey as a partner, as a valuable regional actor. And in some instances, we have also heard that Turkey was also seen as a security threat, as a challenge also for European security. So there is a lot of ambiguity and also discrepancy in these different notions about Turkey relationship. And of course, I think fundamentally, of course, at least for the time being, what we see is also a failure of the accession negotiations, a failure of the membership perspective, which was opened in 2005. And now I think the EU is trying to build something new out of this relationship. However, what can emerge from this relationship will be a downgrade, I mean, from the membership perspective. So I think there is also this difficulty, and it may be only maybe logical that Turkey tries to defer such a downgrading of its status vis-a-vis the EU. But in that also, Turkey is also in a maybe paradoxical situation, because although it is rhetorically attached to the perspective of membership, it is not really doing what is necessary. I mean, it is not implementing the necessary reforms, democratization, rule of law, human rights agenda. It is moving in a quite different path in terms of centralization of power, and also in terms of especially the rhetoric which we have seen in 2020. We see a much more conflictual approach to the European Union. So this, I think, also stems from this failure of the membership perspective and the difficulty of establishing something in its place, in the place of membership perspective. Also, I think there are also some discrepancies. For example, the EU has mostly now centered or focused on the foreign policy dimension of the relationship. Even in the conclusions of the European Council, the part about Turkey is titled as Eastern Mediterranean. So Turkey is viewed from the Eastern Mediterranean context, mostly, I think, as a potential threat to some of the interests of the member states. So in order to maybe prevent Turkey acting as a security threat to especially two of the member states, Greece and southern Cyprus, and also maybe in addition France. Also, we have seen some conflicts with France. So this has, when we look at, for example, the conclusions in 2018, the rhetoric was that Turkey was moving away from Europe. So the focus was more more on the political aspects, especially internal politics of Turkey. However, today, currently, we see that maybe the EU has now accepted that this movement away from Europe at the moment cannot be reversed, or the EU does not have the means to reverse this movement away from Europe. So now they have accepted the situation, but what they are doing is mostly trying to establish the basis of a more transactional relationship. Especially, of course, the refugee issue is an important point of consideration for the European Union, and also the Eastern Mediterranean situation is also another important issue of concern. Maybe also I can say a few points about how, from the point of view of Turkey, this issue is viewed. I think, of course, when we look at the situation from Turkey, maybe we can talk about some different points of view. So it wouldn't be possible to say that there's a single point of view. On the level of the government, I think there is this rhetoric of reforms which we have seen. For example, there is a total discrepancy. The president has announced a human rights action plan and then also an economic reform package, but just afterwards there have been some developments like the closure case of the HDP, also the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. Also, in terms of economic governance, we have seen the change in the central bank. So the actions and the words do not really correspond with each other. So this, I think, also attests to an internal power struggle in Turkey also between different visions for Turkey and its relations with Europe. On the one hand, I think we have groups which are more maybe nationalistic, what we may call as maybe those supporting a non-Western future for Turkey. A future for some, maybe it may be more in line with Turkey's relations with Russia or China. Turkey as a Eurasian power. Maybe for some of these groups, it may be more based on cultural identity. Turkey's especially religious identity may be more pronounced, especially as we have seen in the case of the withdrawal from Istanbul Convention. So a more conservative nationalistic maybe coalition. They are happy with the, I think, status quo, and they don't want any sort of improvement in the relations with the European Union. And I think they are happy with the presidential regime as it is, and they see a democratization as a threat for their envisaged, let's say, vision for Turkey. On the other hand, there are maybe especially some business circles and also some groups that are more progressive in terms of, for example, environmentalists or feminists, those that want to see Turkey's engagement with the EU progress. So I think in those circles also, what we may see as supporters of the EU vision of Turkey, I think they also see a disillusionment with the European Union. So they also see that the EU is not entirely honest in its approach to Turkey. They mostly view Turkey as a transactional, as a part of a transactional relationship, especially, of course, related with the refugee issue and also now the foreign policy and Eastern Mediterranean agenda. And they hope that the EU could act as an anchor as a positive anchor for reform in Turkey in terms of democratization, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. And they see the present approach of the EU towards Turkey as a bit evasive, also a bit hypocritical and also paradoxical. And they think that the EU is turning a blind eye to the developments in Turkey in terms of democracy and human rights in exchange for Turkey's cooperation in security, foreign policy, and refugee issues. And they also, of course, while the EU's approach is different, they mostly see, for example, such issues as problematic, that the EU does not open chapters 23 and 24 in the negotiations. These are the more problematic aspects of the political structure in Turkey. So they ask the question, if the EU wants to, let's say, influence Turkey in a positive democratic direction, then why do they block the accession process? So it seems a bit difficult for them to understand that even one member state can block the whole process. So these very different issues, the Cyprus problem, how it impacts on the relations, etc., also creates maybe a disillusionment and also, let's say, a lack of belief in the EU anymore. So it has also led to a disappointment and disengagement from the European Union. And in this way also, when we look at, for example, public opinion polls, as maybe most people are aware, we had consistently a quite high level of support for EU membership. In 2019, İKV has conducted an opinion poll with TEPAL, and about 60% supported Turkey's EU membership. It was also the same percentage that Kadir Has University's public opinion survey has found in that year. However, we see a certain decrease to 53% in 2020, but still a quite high level of support. However, there is also this sense of frustration that Turkey is blocked from membership, especially due to identity issues, and also that it is not considered as part of Europe. So this positive agenda, maybe, which is proposed, can be seen as let's say, an attempt by the EU to revive the relationship. However, there are still loopholes and some problems in the implementation. Of course, we will maybe have to wait until June whether or not more concrete steps will be taken. And also next week, there will be a visit of the Commission President and the Council President to Turkey. So maybe they will debate about these issues. The most important maybe aspect of the relationship is on the eyes of the EU is the refugee process. However, the customs union modernization may be more important. It may also be more influential in revitalizing the relationship. However, still there are a number of loopholes because both in the report prepared by Joseph Borrell and also in the conclusions, there is mentioned that there are some current problems in the functioning of the customs union, what is called as trade irritants. And first, let's resolve these irritants, and then we can start maybe the process of modernization. However, Turkey's approach is to take it as a package, including both the revision of the present customs union and also expansion of the trade relationship to include new sectors. So, and also, again, the implementation of the customs union to all the member states may still be a condition which may block further progress in this process. So it is positive, but still there may be still loopholes, and there may be still certain problems which may really prevent the implementation of these positive measures. So let me stop there, and maybe in the next round we can elaborate further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Çiğdem. You've raised a number of issues from talking about from Turkey's strategic drift away from the West and the problems this emerges, the power struggle internally in Turkey, where the progressives, the more progressive groups within Turkey are also disillusioned with the EU. Yet paradoxically, though, you mentioned chapters 23 and 24, which the Turkish Foreign Ministry mentions in its statement, which is also sort of a paradox. But in that sense, the public opinion polls, absolutely steadfast, at least over 50% over the last few years, whether it's the IKV poll or the Kadir Has poll. And then, of course, regarding the customs union, one of the issues raised pertaining to Cyprus, there's already a comment or a question regarding this, which we can see later. So let me now give the floor to Kostas Ifantis. But before Kostas takes the floor, you know, you can on Zoom, you can please ask your questions or comments on the chat, and then we'll get to them after the first round of interventions by the speakers. Costa, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you, Costa.
Yes,
you need to, yes.
Yes. Well, let me start by expressing my thanks, my gratitude for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be part in such a panel. Now, your question is how Athens looks into the European Council outcome, the common statement, and what. I will try and describe the feeling in Athens, and I will start by saying that it is seen as a classic EU compromise, where no one is fully satisfied, but no one is left with with a feeling that it has lost out on their preferences. Um, um, Expectations were low, as you can imagine, and there was a degree of vigilance on how the first draft will look like. The first draft was not at all satisfying from the Athens perspective. Then came the Borrell report that was much more balanced and addressed most of the issues that Athens and I assume Nicosia wanted to see addressed, to the extent that I can, as I said, describe it. The goal of Athens' diplomatic efforts, and not just now, but over the last more or less 18 months, where the current, in inverted commas, tug of war started between Athens and Ankara. So the goal of these diplomatic efforts was to more or less to preserve the linkage between the so-called positive agenda that was pushed through by several member states, and in principle, Athens is supportive of such a positive agenda that entails, of course, it's a very limited agenda, but it includes the customs union, the modernization of customs union. It includes the deal over the agreement over migration, and of course the visa waiver issues, plus several other let me put it that way, secondary issues. So the goal was to preserve that linkage between that positive agenda and the Turkish preferences and behavior as it was it has been unfolded in the Eastern Mediterranean over the last year or so. In that respect, in the respect of preserving that linkage between the two, that conditionality, the Athens and I assume again Nicosia are more or less satisfied. Again, allow me to repeat that it is seen as a classic EU compromise, a compromise where more or less decisions are made or no decisions are made, and everything is left in limbo and refer to the next European Council in June. That has been the story so far, starting from October, December, March, and now we are off to the new station, to the new stop in June. So no surprise there. Now, taking account of the facts, first, that Turkey withdrew her vessels from Eastern Mediterranean for the time being. Second, exploratory talks have started. Again, it's not so much a process, but it is certainly a procedure of re-engagement between Athens and Ankara. And third, an informal high-level meeting on Cyprus, yet another attempt to tackle the issue, has been scheduled, and some people claim that the UN initiative has also also aims at facilitating the calming of tensions between Greece and Turkey. So, taking account all these developments in the last 3 months or so, Greece, Athens could not and should not, if I may, push for a more, how can I put it, for a more, again in inverted commas, punitive posture on the EU, on the EU's part. Now, on a more general level, Athens feels that that her diplomatic overture, plus her geostrategic positioning in Eastern Mediterranean and the wider Middle East, as a response to Turkey's overtures, have more or less been effective in elevating the cost for Turkish unilateral maneuvering. The election of the Biden administration helped in changing the strategic context in which Turkey finds itself, a context that is also made up by a very dysfunctional relationship with Cairo, with Tel Aviv, etc., etc. Moreover, any attempt on the EU side now, any attempt by Berlin, Rome, Madrid to up the ante towards Turkey has been more or less contained until trust is being re-established between Athens and Ankara. Having said that, and that's my concluding remark, the mindset in Athens, at least among the Greek Foreign Ministry echelons, the mindset in Athens is that Turkish behavior will not change. Turkish preferences will not change as a result of the EU common statement or any decision taken by EU. And what we need, both in Athens and in Brussels, is a much more comprehensive approach and strategy about the future. But in order to come up with new ideas that can address the central, that can address the strategic issues, we need to a critical question has to be addressed, and this is what is the relationship between Turkey and the EU? Is Turkey another third country? Is it still, I mean, in a substantive way, an enlargement country? We have not been able to address that, and there is it is highly hypocritical on the EU's part that it avoids to deal with that central question. And the result has been that we have all these ad hoc and at a tactical level dealings with Turkey, and this is not a sustainable approach. On the part of Greece, the containment element of the Greek strategy, whether it works on the long run, it remains to be seen. But there is a containment element. What is missing right now, and this is due, and this is the mindset in Athens. This is due to Brussels having no idea of how to deal with, how to approach Turkey, is the engagement element, which is much more critical. And right now, again, the perception is that no one seems to be willing and able to craft a policy that will solve the the riddle, the enigma of Turkish position in Europe. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostas. Thank you very much. I mean, you've raised a couple of issues. It's true. At the end, I'm glad you said this. Otherwise, I was going to raise it, because as you're presenting Athens' position, there's much more elements of reacting to Turkish actions rather than agenda setting. But what you're suggesting is a need. I don't know if it's containment policy. It's probably an attempt at balancing. But there's a need for engagement, right? A need for engagement, both on the part of, in particular, on the part of the EU. And the other thing, too, which is interesting, I mean, while Çiğdem was talking about sort of a power struggle within the Turkish domestic context, there is no power struggle in the Greek context, but Kostas alluded to the fact that when he talked about the policy, which is no punitive actions, because there is a debate about it. There's a camp that suggests that there should be more punitive actions, and that should be the priority of Greek policy. But the government, which is not really facing serious opposition, and I think across the political spectrum among the parties in parliament, it's not, the policy is the same, has managed to moderate the tone and say, yes, no punitive action there. So this, if there is some dissension or some opposition within Greece, that's probably it. But it's not to the extent of what's happening in Turkey. So let's move on to Dorothee. But one of the things that Kostas does raise is exactly that point, that the EU lacks a strategy, and we keep putting off decisions from European Council to European Council, which is true. We have been doing this from October to December, December to March, and now we are talking about June. So let's hear your thoughts, Dorothee.
Merci, Dimitri. So thank you for having us together. We're doing a lot in a Franco-German context. So we're very interested in this other infernal couple, Greeks and Turks, and I don't know if we'll see any complementarity between the two avenues, but just what you said, Dimitri, is exactly how I would introduce my small talk, is that the French think Turkey poses a global strategic challenge. Point. That's it. And we now are also persuaded, I think, that the EU is not the place where this can be addressed. So just as Kostas said, the expectations were rather low, actually, before the Council. But at the same time, what's very interesting for me is that excitement was at a peak concerning Turkey before the Council in France. Like, all the media were after Turkey on all sides, because there was a lot of highlights on the dropping of the Istanbul Convention, but there was also some very specific bilateral tensions between France and Turkey again. So we talk a lot about Turkey, but it was somewhat disconnected from what would happen in the Council and from the conclusions of the Council. And if you look at some comments, official comments after the Council, you find absolutely nothing. So it's like all the excitement took place before the Council. We knew that nothing would come out of it. And we know that we have to contain or deter Turkey by other means. And this is very much the mood. And I think you were talking also of the different camps organizing or structuring in Greece. I don't see a sort of a pro or a sort of more lenient camp for Turkey in France. Currently, everyone thinks we should stand firmer against Turkey in France. I think it goes across all political parties. There's a consensus. It's a sort of national consensus. The only question is, how do we do it? And we also have a second fear vis-à-vis the EU, is that the EU's systematic indulgence vis-à-vis Turkey could also degrade the efficiency of our own deterrence vis-à-vis Turkey. I mean, the EU could be counterproductive regarding our efforts to contain Turkey and to keep Turkey quiet. So there's a lot of disillusionment vis-à-vis the EU these days concerning Turkey. So first thing, the council happened in a context where there were lots of new skirmishes between France and Turkey. I don't know if you saw that Macron and his Minister of Interior made several statements saying that the Turks had been exceptionally aggressive internally, that we could expect interferences in the next presidential election in France. And everybody's been questioning what they have in mind exactly. We don't know. So this is very much a sort of hazy statement with expressing complete distrust with Turkey. So there's a lot of concern about the domestic developments of Turkish influence via the Turkish diaspora in France. And what's interesting is that we had a closed seminar last week, and Günter actually was attended this also, a Zoom, a Franco-German Zoom last week, complete Chatham House rules, okay, but what I took from it was the Germans keep on asking us to be more cautious because they have so many Turks at home and it's very difficult to handle, blah, blah, blah. And we say, but come on, we are the ones who now have a real problem with Erdogan and the Turkish diaspora. We are the places that's being targeted by the Turks currently. And probably you're not, or you don't realize that we have the same problem and we don't want to address it in the same way that you do. So this, of course, is developing against this backdrop of this law on separatism in France, and the two Turkish Islamic associations refusing to sign a common charter, giving the basic for cooperation between the French state and the Muslim institutions in France, etc. And the two Turkish institutions associations were the only one not to sign. So there was a really very sudden, peak into the worries about what the government's doing through the Muslim associations in France. And we are, in some way, in a pre-electoral context, and migrations, Islam, etc., are going to be big issues. And Macron is coming from this sort of uncharted political territory where we don't know if he's left or right, but he seems to be taking some arguments on the right end of the spectrum. And there he has a Minister of Interior who's being extremely aggressive on issues relating to migrations and religion and Islam, especially. So that's the context in France, very tense. So now how do we loop the loop with the EU? The French problem is that we think everybody agrees that there is a strategic challenge with Turkey, but we don't have a common response, and we cannot agree on a common response. And here our main core concern is with the Germans, of course, who are being labeled now by the Turks as allies, and we are the enemy. And as you know, I see Günter is like very happy with this new situation. This can reverse easily, Günter, so don't rejoice too quickly. So we see that there are lots of efforts being put on trying to separate actually the French from the Germans and trying to prevent them from having a common approach to Turkey. But you don't have to prevent them. They don't want to work together on this because they completely disagree on the resources and the means. And so, well, you have parallel channels. And so the French Minister of Foreign Affairs expresses dissatisfaction with the EU context and with the German attitude, and says the discussion has to be at a political level. We see that there is a strategic risk, of course, at regional level. On the domestic side in Turkey, also lots of reactions from all political parties on the threatening of closing the HDP. Of course, the Istanbul Convention, another problem. And then all these issues domestically in Europe, they talked also about cyber attacks from the Turks. So now the Turkish risk of interference is parallel or comparable to the Russian one in the discourse of Macron. So that's really high. And so we feel the growing dissonance, as I said, with the Germans, but potentially also with the US. there's a risk of being isolated, because we know that the Turks are a very important strategic assets for Americans who are just redesigning their regional policy, want to re-engage in the Middle East, and they will suddenly need the Turks at some point. So how do we do with this situation? We have to deter on our side by our means. And, you know, we conducted a specific counterterrorism exercise off the coast of Crete in mid-March, the REA exercise, that was made completely public. And clearly that was a message sent also to the Turks, like, you know, we nearly escalated militarily between us last year. So make it clear that now we'll be prepared for any incident, military incident in the central Mediterranean, and then the ships move to the Eastern Med. And then at the same time, third step, we need the Turks. We cooperate in all fields, the police, judiciary. We have a new surge of worry vis-a-vis on the issue of the jihadi fighters. Do we repatriate, you know, the Daesh wives and kids, etc.? So there we clearly cooperate very closely with the Turks. And we know also now the Turkish file touches upon other strategic layers. How will they cooperate, coexist with the new US administration? We theoretically should be in a honeymoon with the new Biden administration. We're searching for ways to be of use in the Middle East. We offered to mediate on the Iran file, for instance. We don't know if it is of any interest to the Americans, but we desperately want to pair with them. You know, we desperately want to get closer to them, and we know the Turks are somewhere there in the way. There's Russia as well, and there I think the Karabakh conflict was very interesting. You know, there was a vote, the vote of a resolution at the French Senate to recognize the independence of the Karabakh. And this was stopped by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who didn't want to interfere at all. Because we know this is Russia there, and we want the Russians to moderate the Turks or to work with the Turks. Like we don't want to be in the first row. We don't want to be on the forefront there. So there is moderation at the same time. There's a bilateral problem, but we know that this touches upon so many strategic layers that we don't control, that it's dangerous potentially. So the conclusion is that we tend to see everything in a relationship of power with Turkey. There's this specific power competition between France and Turkey, doubtless. It interferes with the EU-NATO arena, and we don't want to trade off anything as yet within the EU frame. We don't see any benefit from what the EU is doing vis-à-vis Turkey. And then finally, I think maybe we fail in our assessment of Turkey's assets. We don't see the mobility of Turkey's foreign policy, for instance, like we missed the reconciliation with Egypt. We don't understand. We still see Turkey as more isolated than it is, probably because we are isolated ourselves, you know, because we don't cooperate. We're not multilateral enough. We don't socialize enough within the EU to understand where the Turks are, probably. We think we have leverage on Turkey because Turkey is dependent on us. And there again, maybe this is a mistake. Maybe this is a misassessment of where we are really. We think there is a Turkish fear that we will use this leverage as well. And this means, like on the economic side, for instance, we do follow very closely what's happening, what the current financial crisis in Turkey. So I have the vague impression from all the discussions we had over the last weeks that we are actually betting on a weakening of the Erdogan system recently. We see more political confusion in Turkey. We follow this economic crisis. We're in favor of more economic pressuring. We want the Germans to do it. They don't want to, but we keep on hinting at the fact that the Germans are the only one who can be efficient in that area. And I have the impression in some way that we're buying time. We're like containing the Turks while we hope for a weakening of the Erdogan system. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dorothee, for this very frank sort of assessment. I mean, as I was listening to you, especially the French position, I keep thinking, you know, the High Representative Borrell always talks, in particular when he talks about China and Russia, that they are both uh, partners, competitors, and rivals. And I suppose officially for the EU, Turkey is a partner and a competitor, but it might be moving as well into the rival position. And I think when you describe sort of the French perception, you can see this happening, even though at at the end, I mean, when you say that the policy is based on a lack of maybe understanding of Turkish diplomacy and movements and Turkey itself, and hoping for weakening of Erdogan, well, this is also seems to be to me, and as I'm going to give the floor now to Günter, in a way indicative of what the EU policy is. I mean, by putting decisions off, A, because the EU cannot agree among themselves, and here you have France and Germany that do not agree, so it's difficult to get consensus. But by putting decisions off from time to time, and I remember in a closed meeting a couple of months ago, a very high representative of the External Action Service saying that no decisions, no strategy will be formed on the part of the EU until 2023, meaning that it will come once we have a clear thing who wins the elections, whether it's Erdogan or not, and then we can have a strategy. But there, so what I'm saying is that based on what you just said, this sort of links the French position of waiting what's going to happen domestically in Turkey to the EU position, which is also looking very closely at, you know, the economic and political issues, and maybe the fact that we're coming towards the end of an era. I don't think so, but that we might be coming towards it. Günter, floor is yours.
No, thank you, Dimitri, and thank all the other speakers for setting the floor, of setting the context. First, to what Dorothee said, why I was laughing. I was laughing because she used the expression the Germans had been labeled the new allies, and we know that labeling is normally used in a negative way, and therefore it should be upgraded. And as you rightly said, Dorothee, if you are labeled an ally, then this is not maybe not only a compliment. There is also some other dimension to it, some peril to it. I was very much impressed what Dorothee said about the public discussion in France, particularly on the disconnect between the discussion on Turkey and the expectations toward the European Council conclusions. I think this is for the European Union a very dangerous development. And we see it already that different European powers, particularly France and Greece, are in a way entering into military and security cooperation with Middle Eastern and African countries. And there is naturally, this may have two unintended results. First, that the ability of the European Union to act in any way together jointly in foreign policy is undermined even further. And second, naturally, that these European powers may also be drawn into conflicts in Africa and in the Middle East, between the Gulf states, for example, between the UAE and Turkey, and maybe in a way drawn into conflicts with whose dynamics they are only partly able to degree. And it's not by coincidence that I wrote lastly a piece in the Cyprus Mail where some commentator warned the Cypriots to engage too closely with Israel, because Israel is a country that has many friends but has also many enemies, and this may also impact the Cypriot security. But this is only one remark. When it comes to the difficulties between France and Germany, I think Dorothee is right in depicting the situation. Maybe I would set the tone a little bit different. I would not put the whole, if there is blame, the whole blame on Germany, because I don't think that Germany is in a way able to shape European decisions unilaterally. We know that when it comes to Turkey, also Spain and Italy are very reluctant to do any step that is in a way affecting the anyhow fragile Turkish economy, because both countries, together with Germany, have vested interest in the German economy. And therefore, I think we need to think about, we cannot only talk about Germany, we have to talk about those countries who have a lot of interest and who profit from economic cooperation, and those countries who don't profit in this regard or in this dimension, and therefore are able to, or are more inclined to a more, how Kostas said it, punitive agenda. Now, when it comes to how the conclusions have been, and maybe let me first say that such a disconnect between the discussions on Turkey and the conclusions of the council, this disconnect was not there in Germany in that way. There is still a kind of hope that the Europeans could come up with a joint foreign policy, not only on Turkey but on the whole. And I think this has naturally to do with different styles of foreign policy of the Federal Republic of Germany and of France. And this has a lot to do with the means we have at our hands. These are also quite different. But now, when it comes to how the council conclusions are viewed in Germany, I think Germans are quite content, because first there had not been sanctions, and without sanctions there is no escalation in Turkish-European relations and in Turkish-German relations, and therefore there is no threat or no danger of, for example, escalation in the migrant questions, and there is no escalation in the question how Turkey is in a way mobilizing or not mobilizing its huge diaspora in Germany. I think this is the first point. A second point, I would sense a kind of quite contrary to what Dorothee said, a kind of, it's too big a word, but kind of a very small re-empowerment of the European Union towards Turkey, because at the end of the day there is something like now an almost emerging pattern of how to deal with Turkey, and there is more unity, and I think we have now really a very elaborated approach of sticks and carrot, and it's a middle way to which all the European countries that could really agree, and therefore I think there is the Germans are quite pleased with the conclusions, and they feel that Europe is more able to act together towards Turkey than before. I think also there is no need for more harsh or more restrictive measures. This also pleases the German government, because then there is no need to talk, for example, about arms sales. And this also would run counter also to economic interests. And there is also, and I think Çiğdem Nas referred to, is there is a tendency in a way to end or to come to a new framework for Turkey-European relations. Çiğdem mentioned that there was no talk about, again, or anymore of the fact that Turkey formally is still a membership country, a country from a membership candidate. And it was only a passing mentioning of the deteriorating domestic situation in Turkey. And with this, there is a tendency of, let me be cynical, of fixing the Turkish question. Because, you know, in Germany, we had a large quarrel between the Social Democrats and the Greens at the one hand side and the Conservatives at the other hand side when it comes to Turkish membership. And what is now emerging out of the political developments is exactly what Chancellor Merkel always wanted, a kind of privileged relationship with Turkey, but to forestall Turkey's membership in the European Union. And we know that even that the customs union is discussed amongst closed doors or behind closed doors as a kind of as a kind of supplement for a substitution for full membership. And I think another reason why the Germans are fine with the conclusions, not with the conclusions, but with the process that leads to the conclusions, namely a more coordinated approach, or maybe at least a rhetoric of a more coordinated approach with the US on Turkey. And there is an emerging area for cooperation with the US in times when there are difficulties with the US, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China. And I think also this mixture, this double approach of both carrots and stick, of the offering of a positive agenda, but at the same time to hold in its hand and it's more spelled out than ever, the restrictive measures. We never had such openly spelled out with restrictive measures. For example, as far as I know, until the conclusions, Germany would have rejected any notion that, for example, travel warnings had something to do with the policy of Turkey. It was almost objective. It was due to particular threats, be it terrorism, be it political unrest. But now, for the first time in an official EU document, travel warnings are mentioned as a political instrument. And we see other proposals, other ideas of how to harm Turkey if Turkey is not going to adapt or to continue to moderate its policy. And therefore, I think there is now an emerging suitcase of restrictive measures on which Europeans in tendency agree. And I think this double-edged strategy is in a way also, it suits what we see in Turkey, because I think in Turkish European relations we are facing Turkey as a challenge in a twofold way. The one is assertive or aggressive for Turkish foreign policy against European member states, and the others are risks that come out of the instability of the Turkish state until today. And we see this most prominently in economic terms. And there are sources who talk about that the current financial crisis is also a crisis of liquidity, and that Turkey is not able, for example, to protect its currency. And therefore, Turkey may enter into an even deeper economic crisis. And this may pose challenges to the European banking system. It may pose challenges to the value chain. And therefore, the European Union has to be in a situation to act both against assertive foreign policy, but at the same time to have instruments to support Turkey in the case of a deepened economic crisis. And I think I'll leave it with this.
Thank you very much, Günter, for your presentation and presenting the German perspective and why Germany feels satisfied with the conclusions. But two thoughts come to mind. I mean, if I were the Turkish government listening now to perspectives from France, Germany, and Greece, one could see that the EU is basically divided, and this was something that could be exploited because we have the key actors that have different positions. But the last thing you talked about, which is also interesting, regarding how Turkey is seen in two ways. So one is as a challenge in general because of its actions, but because of the economy and the challenges this poses. Well, because there's a big debate in Greece too about the different crises, simultaneous crises occurring in Turkey. Well, I would posit that all of them are not really systemic. They have been caused by the Turkish government. I mean, and that's the interesting thing. So even the economic challenges that's happening right now with the whole, unorthodox way of dealing with the central bank and interest rates and so on, it's a challenge that was caused by the government. Same thing with outlawing the HDP, rule of law challenges. So it's very interesting that we have to deal with, because this is also an instrumentalization of policy, domestic policy, and therefore reflect on foreign policy, which makes it even more complex in that sense, right? So I take your point about the impact of the failure of the Turkish economy and liquidity issues and so on, and of course the fear of German, Italian, and Spanish banks and Dutch banks, among others. But why are we here? Because the government itself decided to go on this path, and it's very interesting that we've come to this. maybe should I maybe take a few questions and then give you time to also think of some of the things that your colleagues have reflected. There are quite a few comments. Let me take them in order that they've come in. So Ambassador Theodorou, first, and I mentioned this before, Çiğdem talks about the obligation to recognize the Republic of Cyprus, right? And this is an issue that also is very clear in the conclusions when it comes to the customs union. There's a mention there in a way that the recognition aspect has to be dealt with. Then there is a question about, okay, again, Ambassador Theodorou, the Turkish position vis-a-vis the European Union is a challenge for the EU and NATO. Do you think that the relationship between the EU and Turkey should respect European values, principles, the European acquis, and so on, as well as the interests of the member states? And so how does this impact on an integration process? Then there's a question about, Turkey pivoting to the east, towards China, or rather to the EU, rather than the EU. I think it's pivoting towards itself without knowing where it's going necessarily, but that's an issue, it's pivoting away. And so do you see the intensification of the Sino-Turkish relations representing an obstacle to Turkey joining the EU? Interesting. Andrew de Munter had a comment on Facebook where it's a comment, but I think it's in line with what some of the speakers talked about, which is, yes, the UCO conclusions are basically about buying time on both sides. A tacit agreement, he says, on pretending. So he's being cynical. And which also raises another issue. He raises an issue which is also interesting, because we are talking about the differences among the member states, but there's also differences between the institutions. I mean, there's a real clash of war right now between the European Parliament and the Council, right? Parliament says we evaluate and judge Turkey on the basis of its accession process, and the Council has adopted a very transactional relationship. And that creates tensions also, and therefore the need maybe of a strategy. And then a brief question from Mehmet Uksul, who is an ARD correspondent here in Germany. What can be expected from the Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen visit next week to Ankara? Any real progress regarding the EU-Turkey relationship? I mean, Çiğdem, you referred to it. So let's start with these and maybe go back to the order that you spoke and start answering some of them, whichever ones you want, and then I can go on with other questions as well. Çiğdem, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think that, of course, the EU's approach only focusing on the foreign policy perspective has been quite limited. And for example, I, on my part, expected the conclusions to pay more attention on the recent developments, like the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, the HDB case, etc. However, the Council did not make any last-minute changes, I think, regarding giving more space to the political developments. And I found this quite a limited perspective, because, as you have said, the foreign policy problems between EU and Turkey cannot be taken in isolation from the internal developments in Turkey. I mean, the internal power struggle is very much related also with the search for this blue homeland, the more, let's say, maximalist foreign policy positions of Turkey. And also, of course, the government and the president also, I think, uses this, has also, not maybe currently, but also in 2020, has also used the foreign policy stances in order to gain more ground internally, especially using nationalist rhetoric. So I think in order to, I mean, containing Turkey cannot be, let's say, thought in isolation from the internal politics of Turkey and the values in the relationship. Of course, I mean, the EU has its own problems with values, its existing member states. So I think it's not in a position, let's say, to focus much on the European values in its relations with Turkey. However, I think what we are talking about, as you have mentioned, is also a governance crisis in Turkey. It's not only an economic crisis, it's not only about a nationalistic foreign policy, but I think there is a governance crisis, the inability of the government to engage in a more rational governance. I mean, we have seen it in the case of the central bank. The previous appointment in November raised some hopes that there would be some improvement in the economic governance. However, now we have seen that again it has taken a turn for a more maybe limited, a more ideological approach, and also the internal power struggles is making it more difficult to engage in reform. So if Turkey cannot make this transition, reform its structure, because the presidential system, I don't think it is working. I mean, it has created a chaos, I think, and it is proving more and more difficult day by day to govern the country in an effective manner. And there are also additional shocks from the international system, the COVID-19 crisis, etc. So I think the EU should have a more coherent approach towards Turkey, not only focusing on the foreign policy, but also on the internal politics of the country. And I agree with Günter that the threat that may be caused for Europe as a whole is not only about the foreign policy issues or the bilateral relations, but a more general failure of Turkey, which it would create for stability, and also it would limit the potential of Turkey as a partner for the EU. I mean, as a trustworthy partner to cooperate with. And also, in addition to containing the status quo, let's say buying some time, as Dorothee has said, we can also think of it as in the reverse manner. It may be that Turkey is also buying time to actually engage in a fuller authorization of authoritarianism, let's say, to also engage in a much more strict centralist position in Turkey, and this would be again detrimental for European interests. So I think this buying time should be also thought out. I mean, it may also lead to further deterioration of Turkey relations. And also, lastly, let me also mention about the issues of the future. I mean, it's not only about today, but the future, especially when we think about the EU's new agenda, especially the Green Deal, digital agenda, the public health agenda, the health union. In all these issues, cooperation with Turkey is essential. Even if Turkey will not ever become a member of the EU, it is very much important for these issues. I mean, the Green Deal is for whole Europe. If you cannot get Turkey also on the train, then you will not be able to reach the climate goals. It is a difficult endeavor, but also the neighboring countries, candidate countries, should be engaged. So in order for Turkey to adapt itself to the changing conditions of the international system, I think its policy towards Turkey should be, I think, much more coherent, much more maybe strategic, but also not only isolating interests from values, also taking into account that interests and values should go hand in hand. Otherwise, the relationship with Turkey will not be sustainable, and it will be even difficult to create some sort of a strategic partnership out of it. I mean, this conflictual situation may continue. And lastly, regarding the Sino relations, the relations with China, I think that's a possibility, because recently we have seen a new agreement being signed with Iran, between Iran and China. So I think China's influence is increasing, and Turkey is also seeking new funds. And as it finds it more and more difficult to find new sources of credits, etc., in Western markets, then it may turn more and more to China for investment. We have now the Istanbul Channel project, which the government says that it is going to put into implementation. And here the Chinese may see new opportunities there, and it may create a sort of a new dependent relationship between China and Turkey. So I think both we in Turkey, of course, are apprehensive about the situation, but these issues should also be taken into consideration in the overall future of the relationship. So thank you.
Thank you, Çiğdem. You raise a number of issues. Of course, climate change is mentioned in the conclusions, right? I mean, there's a reference to it, which is interesting because that allows for the possibility of thinking in terms of the Green Deal and including Turkey in that sense.
That was positive, I think. Yeah.
That was positive. Kostas.
Okay. A very brief comment on Cyprus. I think it is important to remember that Cypriot anxieties, let me put it that way, has been more or less contained and not only now, but if you go back to 2015, 2016, the EU has been very careful in not allowing the feud between Cyprus and Turkey in Eastern Mediterranean to keep the whole agenda as a hostage, which of course runs counter to values and principles, etc., etc. But this is beside the point I would like to make. And what I would like to make is that in a month from now, we are going to have the beginning of a new initiative by the United Nations. It's the five-party, informal for the time being, a high-level meeting in Geneva. Now, what is interesting about it is the methodology. So far, if you look back to the history of the diplomatic efforts to arrive at a solution in Cyprus, has been always, the beginning has been intercommunal talks, and if there is a prospect of moving forward, then there was a high-level meeting in Geneva or in the United Nations. Anyway, and I think the experience of the painful experience of the collapse of the latest rounds, going back to 2017, Crans-Montana talks, there has led the Secretary General of the United Nations to believe, and this is also written in his report back in 2017, that that next time a strategic agreement should come first before the detailed negotiations start on at least 5 of the 6 chapters. Those familiar with the Cyprus issue know what I mean. Anyway, and this is interesting. This is interesting. And this is because the Secretary General, I think, wants to know right from out of the bat that whether the positions that have been articulated by the Turkish side and the Turkish Cypriot side, are more or less a maximalist position that will be moderated during the actual negotiations, or reflects a red line on the part of Turkey and the Turkish Cypriot community. So this would be extremely interesting, and that change in the methodology, that change in the approach, led me to believe that this might be the last UN initiative for some time. Now, if the conclusion that the Secretary General arrives at in late April is that the two positions are, he cannot reconcile the two positions, that the parties hold their ground, then we might see that Cyprus issue will either remain stagnant, or something else will come up in the following months. If you follow the Turkish and the Cypriot press, then the hope is that there will be at least one more meeting in June or July. But I will not hold my breath right now. I don't nurture any serious hope, but you'll never know. So this is my brief comment on that, and one more, but I don't think we have time to really look into it. From what we've said today, and this is not, of course, a revelation, is that the whole thing, the whole context, the whole, if you like, course of EU-Turkish relations since 2004 has been a series of misperceptions. I'm not going to go into details, but I will remind myself and everybody else that it was Germany actually who killed the EU, the Turkish EU vocation in 2007 by when Angela Merkel, along with President Sarkozy at that time, declared that there is no real prospect for full membership for Turkey, without offering any alternative that could have been attractive to Turkey at that time. Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Günter referred to it as a strategic partnership in that sense. It wasn't just Germany, France, the Greek government, the new Greek government also contributed to it. I mean, there are many culprits on the EU side, just like the culprits on the Turkish side. Dorothee, I know you also have to run. We'll try to close this in about 5 minutes. So please go ahead.
Yeah. So three very small points. First point is I take Günter's statement about the small empowerment of the EU that's being shown through the process of the Council and the conclusion. I think it's going in the right direction. Yes. Because it was a complete cacophony, I mean, until now. So at least we've come together and been thinking together seriously about Turkey as I said, as a strategic challenge, say, for the EU. Second point, I think, yes, the values are absolutely indispensable. And this is going back to my disconnection problem that I was talking about. France considers now that the EU is hopeless. There's a great disappointment because there was a lot of positive projections. I mean, the EU was seen at least as clean. It's like helpless, but it's clean. And now the EU is just mingling into these very sort of dirty waters with Turkey. It means that we lose a lot in terms of values, and the EU becomes extremely unpopular at the national level. So I think we have to think about this disappointment. And the third point is I completely agree with you, Dimitri, when you highlight the fact that it's also the Turks' fault if things go in the wrong direction economically. So I think a technocratic EU is now irrelevant because Turkey's governance system does not deliver. There's no competent bureaucracy managing the files in Turkey currently. So there's a mismatch. The expectations that we have do not match what Turkey is able to deliver currently. This is why probably the dialogue has to move to a more sort of political area or non-dialogue, I don't know. But I mean, it's clear that now we set, the expectations, we want you to do this and that. This is not going to happen. It can't, because the system is too much a one-person, too disorganized, absolutely not focusing on what we expect. So sometimes you'd wonder if you're conspiracy oriented, whether it's intended or not. We want Turkey to fail, maybe. I don't know. But clearly it's not, it doesn't work. Von der Leyen said that we would have a more geopolitical commission. This is what we need, but this is not what we're doing. So I stop there.
Thank you, Dorothee. Günter, there's also a question maybe addressed directly to you, if you saw in the chat, about maybe after the elections in Germany with the Greens in a coalition, whether that will change the whole issue regarding the arms sales that you talked about to Turkey.
Yeah, thank you. I have noticed the question, and really, I think we could expect a change, a slight change, at least in Germany's foreign policy, with a government made up of Greens and Social Democrats and maybe the Free Democrats, because we know that the Greens are much more critical on arms exports. They are much more critical on environmental issues, and Turkey has not signed the Paris Agreement. They are much more concerned about human rights. and they are much more, at least in rhetoric, for a principled and value-based foreign policy. And I think therefore, at least at the beginning of a government with Greece, with green participation, there will be some ruptures in German-Turkey relations. It will not be easy to continue as usual. 3 points I see closely interrelated. Çiğdem talked about a governance crisis in Turkey, and I fully agree. And there was a question about the so-called Z generation in Turkey, if we should put hope on it. And another question, if the current foreign policy is backed by the majority of the population. And there was also what you said, Dimitri, there is a mismatch between, I think it was Dorothee who was saying that Turkey is not, the system at the moment is not able really to respond to a particular strategic policy of Europe, because it's not capable of doing things. And I think this all gives us a picture of a country with huge potential when it comes to its military might, when it comes to its industrial base, when it comes to its still young population, and when it comes with its dynamism, and when it comes to its positioning in a surrounded by smaller, weaker, and sometimes even fragile states. And therefore there's a huge potential, but low actual use of this potential. And I think this particular forces the European Union in such a double strategy, namely to offer cooperation, but at the same time to make it conditional. And therefore, I think there is a rhetoric, I think, at least since 2013, when Turkey began, or when the Turkish government really began to show its more authoritarian tendencies. There is always a talk of strategic patience, that at the end of the day, the more moderate part of society would, in a way, be able to assert itself against the government. And we have seen that until 2013, the situation was only deteriorating. And therefore, I think it's high time for a coherent strategy that presents offers an agenda, but also that defines really red lines for the Turkish government. I think we have it now. The question, I don't want to talk to, may I have 2 minutes more? Yeah, I think the question is between France and Germany at the one hand side, and also Greece or on the other, a more punitive policy or a more accommodating policy. And I think we all know that neither a strong punitive approach nor a totally accommodative approach is to be agreed upon in the European Union, because interests are different, threat perceptions are different. And therefore, I think the only way out is when we talk about a rules-based relationship. What can we only mean with a rules-based relationship in a situation where the membership process is factually dead and the normative framework of the membership process is not longer politically valid? That's a fact, because there is no membership process. There is no perspective of the membership process. Only on the side of Europe. Europe is not able to swallow Turkey, to integrate Turkey. Europe is not able to integrate the small Balkan countries. And therefore, I think we have to look how can a value-based relationship be thought of beyond the membership process. And therefore, in this way, I think we should try to agree on political issues. For example, when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, there should be an agreement in Europe that cooperation with Turkey should happen, but can only happen when Turkey declares to adapt to international law, and at the end of the day to accept the ruling of the court in The Hague or of the Maritime Court in Hamburg. When it comes to the Cyprus issue, there can be cooperation with Turkey when Turkey sticks to the internationally agreed framework for a solution of the Cyprus issue. When it comes to the migration, there can only be cooperation when there are minimal juridical, legal standards and humanitarian standards in Turkey. And therefore, I think we have to agree on value-based, be it international, in the international law, or be it in the humanitarian area. We have to agree on how to define a rules-based policy on Turkey for every policy area, because only then we have a chance to overcome selfish economic or security-related interests of the member states. We have, in a way, to objectify the debate.
Thank you, Günter, for these comments. Of course, I mean, I agree, and actually, I think the theme of the second webinar could actually be on a strategy, because we've all talked about it, about the need of a new sort of model, and maybe have a debate about it. But on what you're saying at the end, and maybe Çiğdem wants to add something about it, the problem with that is, fundamentally, I agree with it, but until we get to that, it leaves countries like Greece, and it leaves countries like Cyprus at the front line, facing the threat. And I don't know how sustainable that is either. I mean, there's an issue there, right? Because ultimately, until we get Turkey to accept international law, as you say, on the Eastern Med issues, or recognize Cyprus and so on, if it doesn't happen, we are facing the issue, and especially on migration. So there are many dilemmas, I think, for all the countries involved. And I think the strategy approach is probably the next step. And I think it's upon us as experts, as analysts, as commentators, to start thinking. And my wish, my hope also is that maybe the Turkish-Greek tandem can actually come up with proposals, not only within the scope of the project, that would surprise our French and our German friends, and find ways to reconcile things. For example, Çiğdem was talking about the Green Deal, and one of the things I've been proposing is maybe we need to come up, and this could be a Greek initiative together with a Turkish initiative, with a new regional sort of format, a BSEC for the Eastern Med, Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization for the East Med, where a lot of these issues are in there, where all the littoral states are involved, and where we deal with the Green Deal, which is renewables, which takes some of the pressures away from the hydrocarbons issue, as well as climate change, which is a reality facing all of us, and we know the consequences. An economic cooperation mechanism among the countries of the region, where the EU has a role as well, but it allows for, at least at the regional level, for the development of these issues, because ultimately it's all about trust building, and right now that seems to be lacking. And we see this trust building lacking even among EU member states, ultimately, when they try to come up with common positions and conclusions when they're dealing with Turkey. So I'm not going to take any more questions. We've run over. Çiğdem, do you want to say anything, maybe in reaction to what Günter or Dorothee or Kostas said?
I mean, I agree with your last point, because the issues between Turkey and Greece, and also the Cyprus issue, the approach of the sides are very different. I mean, Turkey's approach to the issue and the expectations of the EU regarding recognition of Cyprus. I think at the moment, I don't see any sort of easy solution. The best that we can do is to live with these problems, and not to inflate these problems, not to really touch them, but to learn to live with them. So I think the best way out of this would not maybe wait for the EU to come up with a resolution, but as you have said, to come up maybe with a regional perspective. It was somehow successfully done in the past between Turkey and Greece, so it can, I think, be done again. And also, of course, in the past few years, we have also seen that Turkey has been dangerously isolated, and this Eastern Med Forum has been let's say, engaging in certain agreements without taking into account Turkey. So that also created maybe a backlash in terms of Turkey's more assertive policy. So integrating Turkey in a multilateral framework, I think, could be the solution. But of course, whether or not you can do it under the present circumstances. However, of course, there is also the pressure of the economics on Turkish government at the moment. So this can be also maybe an opportunity. Of course, it is a crisis, it has its risks, but it may also maybe create the conditions for more moderate approach and also maybe more support to such multilateral initiatives. And also, of course, bringing in the climate issue is also very important, because what I can also maybe add is that there is growing awareness in Turkey about this importance of the climate issue, maybe not at the highest level, but in the societal level. Many civil society organizations are very much involved. There are a lot of webinars, etc. Of course, it doesn't mean anything, but maybe this awareness may also put some pressure for a more multilateral approach, including climate and also bilateral and regional perspective. So I agree. I mean, let's think positive, let's say.
All right. Kostas, you want to add anything, or we are all set?
Just one not so optimistic note, allow me. Although I totally agree with that we need proposals, that we need initiatives to enrich the agenda and in a sense take out the heat of it. I'm afraid that that it's not going to be easy, because the geopolitical stakes have been raised. They have been raised, I must say, by Ankara, with the homeland, the blue homeland narrative has been raised when President Erdogan attacked Sisi, the Sisi regime in Cairo following the coup against Morsi, has been raised with the breakdown of Turkish-Israeli relations. So yes, we need a concerted effort, and we need new ideas. But what we really need is a change of sort of change of mindset in Ankara and elsewhere, of course, and elsewhere. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all of you. Dorothee had to leave us for another meeting. But I appreciate you taking your time. We went a bit over time. This was interesting. I see there's still a lot of people with us, so it shows the interest in the topic. And we will be posting a video soon on our YouTube channel and some website. We'll be announcing it of this debate. And we will soon be announcing a few other webinars as part of this project. And I think there was a lot of food for thought today from all the speakers and the issues that they raised and some of the questions about how we could move on to other themes to discuss. Thank you very much, Çiğdem, Günter, Kostas, and Dorothee.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.